Well, hi, everybody. This is a pleasure to be with all of you. One of the things that I talked about last week or last time that we met, the piece that I brought in was, taking the integral lens and the critical realist lenses and looking at, you know, basically the problem of cultural polarization, what I was calling algorithmic undertow and algorithmic tunnels. And I put together those thoughts, about 2 days prior to our presentation, just thinking, what can I bring to this? And it turned out that there was enough there that I've ended up developing it into a full paper, and it was just published in one of the journals from CIIS. And so we'll make that available. It's a fuller treatment. So I mentioned all that to say I probably won't go over in great detail what was in that paper right now, but yeah, basically, we have familiar concepts like uh, echo chambers and filter bubbles and things like that. And looking at some of the problems that we've been experiencing with the cultural and political polarization in the country, and just the experience I think probably many of us have had. I've definitely had it of looking at current events or news items and possibly talking to different individuals in your family or in your community and having such radically different takes on what seemed to be the shared event and the kind of real fracturing of consensus reality. And so yeah, there are words that already cover that somewhat, like an echo chamber or something. But if you take something like critical realism, which looks at a stratified view of reality, where you look at what are generative mechanisms, what's the level of the real, what are some of the generative mechanisms behind what we experience. The level of the actual is events that are taking a place that are actually happening, whether they're observed or not. And then the empirical is what's actually showing up in our immediate experience and what we can detect immediately without a lot of extra effort, theoretical inquiry, or it's basically what's empirically available to our senses. And if you begin to look at that stratified layer and then the four quadrants and other lenses of integral theory, you can see a lot of dynamics going on that are operating across domains. They're operating at the level of economic drivers of organizations and decisions of the construction of the algorithms. There are different ways that these are actually deployed across global digital systems. And then there are the things that we actually experience, the infinite scroll and the different kinds of things that people get pulled into, and the recommendations, and all of the types of experiences that we have in social media that become reinforcing. And so Bhaskar has this idea of demi-realities. And this is something that Mark Edwards was also going to get into. He talked a little bit about it last week, which was he talked about just stories and the causal impact of stories. And so demi-realities and his treatment of stories are related. For demi-realities, basically, it is a, you could say a version of the real, which is typically partial and is built on certain, you could say, occlusions, certain absenting of phenomena and reinforcement of other phenomena. So it's a partial view of reality, and it could even be largely false. It could be a whole conspiracy world narrative that doesn't have much grounding in reality, but it's nevertheless causally efficacious, even if it's not actually real, um, in circulating through our media and informing our sense making. Um, it actually impacts how we organize, what decisions we make, what we see and what we don't see, all of those things. So a demi-reality is, it could be an ideology, it could be, something that shows up in a filter bubble. Uh, it's a partial reality, and it could be more or less true and false. It doesn't really matter to be causally efficacious. And that's something that Mark was also talking about, just the power of stories. It doesn't really matter how true stories are. They can have effects, and some of the effects can be, significant enough that you don't really need to worry about that. So there has been, I think, in the last, at least the last 2 decades, a kind of postmodern gaming of that recognition, and a deliberate, actually, a deliberate, informed, intentional uh, decision to actually circulate those kinds of narratives, um, because they only need to circulate for a short time. It doesn't matter if they're debunked a little bit later. They have impact, already just in their circulation. And also, as I've talked about with Corey and multiple other people, there's been some pretty interesting explorations of how, for instance, Soviet propaganda works, and one of the key elements of that is basically just flood the information landscape with competing narratives. It doesn't matter how true and false they are. It's good if they're all at least partially true, but undermine any sense of there being a stable, confirmable reality that's shared by many people. And that kind of fragmentation can then be exploited for various purposes. So this approach, then, I was using critical realist and integral lenses to try to explore how algorithmic undertow gets set up. And that's basically, it's a phenomenon that spans, multiple levels of reality in multiple quadrants, and is self-reinforcing. And it usually operates outside of our awareness. And so using critical realist and integral lenses to begin to reflect on what's happening, what are the dynamics, what are the elements involved, and then also how can we developmentally scaffold practices that helps us get out of the algorithmic undertow, to be able to make it into object, to be able to uh, develop some kind of digital mindfulness, to use different systems that help us recognize when we are within an algorithmic tunnel, something that's self-reinforcing. It's a demi-reality that's self-reinforcing and actively absenting of certain aspects of reality. How do we begin to recognize that and then counteract that through behavioral practices, through using systems that help clarify and bring those things to light? In my talk, I mentioned something called Ground News, which is just one example. It's a media organization that pastes stories all alongside each other from differently politically valenced publications, and you can see how the emphases change depending on typically the ideological alignment of different organizations, and then make your own assessment so that you can begin to see how different narratives are being reinforced. So those are some suggestions, and then I went beyond that into thinking about more deeper meta level kinds of work and hygiene, and ultimately integrative, you could say, almost say intuitive, holistic levels of sense making. That's another aspect of Mark's presentation that, if he does make it in today, we'll be able to look at. He talks about kind of the gut level, the reasoning level, and the intuitive level of sense making. At the intuitive level, he's putting kind of the holistic gestalt grasping meta level kind of cognition, vision logic. So that's just a bit of a synopsis and a highlight. I hope it was clear enough and lit up enough notes from what we talked about last time to be helpful. But I'd be interested in any thoughts or reflections on that. And I do have something else I want to copy over to this computer. While anyone asks something, I'm going to do a little technical thing, and then but I'll be listening here.
Hi, Bruce.
Hi.
Hi, everyone. Yes, listening to this as someone who is most at home in the upper left and lower left, psychology and the humanities, I was listening, and what I heard is the way we have functioned, I believe, ever since we were Homo sapiens. My rudimentary understanding of the cognitive sciences, I only have this in kind of an impressionistic way, but as sensory input comes in, the various aspects of our brain see a pattern, make some sense of it, tell a story, and we have a reaction. And it actually, we basically tell ourselves what's happening. And this is even before we use language. It's like that thing on the path, I've jumped back. My whatever functions in my brain have seen a snake, and I've jumped back 6 feet. And then I realized it's actually a coil of rope. I mean, this is the way we have functioned before we even developed our rational senses. And then as we layer in emotions, concrete operational thinking, formal operational thinking, we get more sophisticated at these various levels. But what I just think I heard you outline, what I heard was this is the way we have always operated, less sophisticated at earlier stages of development. But now with social media and the internet, we are moving up a whole new level where these factors and where bad actors are exploiting the possibilities to deceive. And I think we can all think of examples. And so we are challenged to learn how to make our way in this new landscape at yet another level of sophistication. But the basic, what's the word I'm looking for? What's going on here is something we've been living with even before we were Homo sapiens. We just now have to learn to adapt and self-regulate at a whole new level of complexity. That's my summary of what I heard.
Yes, very much so. Thank you. And yeah, I talked about it in one way as in that paper as a kind of a evolutionary mismatch and the need to develop noospheric wisdom. There's a kind of noospheric cloud I was talking about us living in now where, for most of our history, we've been, evolved for making sense of, making meaning within the world as delivered by our senses within the time scale and spatial scale that those things afford. And of course, we have deep imaginative capacities that we can imagine, other worlds and deep histories and tell myth and weave elaborate stories. And we've had that, for ages. And so but nevertheless, that's, you could say, an excursion from what is our normal everyday reality of living within the bounds of our senses and the temporal and spatial scope that they normally afford. Whereas now with our digitally mediated environments, we live within this noospheric cloud of constantly circulating narratives from multiple places that are just replacing each other and circulating at a speed that would not happen, in kind of a normal bounded human relational context. And, these things are not only flooding us at a faster rate than we've really, I think, been designed to process, but they're also being deliberately shaped by multiple forces, not only cultural forces or political ones, but technological ones and economic ones and others. So that's this kind of evolutionary mismatch that I was talking about. And what else I wanted to go in today, we'll kind of get into that to some degree about why it's especially important to develop, you could say, this meta level studies and meta level perspective for making sense of some of the wicked messes that we confront. So yeah, I'll get into that a little bit more later. I see a hand from William.
Yes. Yeah, this is sort of a follow-up to what Karen was saying and what you were just saying. The amount of effort that I feel that I have to put in order to find some core truth is it's overwhelming. And this is where I'm starting to get a little bit lazy, where I don't have the bandwidth to spend tons of time. So I default to some of the traditional institutions. I read the Guardian every day and the New York Times and the Washington Post, and I look at the sources of the information. And I don't know, I just hark back to the old days where you could read something and then basically take it as, truth, more or less, right? I mean, you knew it was biased, but it was like, more or less real. And I was wondering about, what do you see the role of institutions, and isn't it still possible to simply look at the source, go to, academia, go to, government ministries, and, find out what they are saying, because they have filtered things into what they believe is the truth. And I think it just saves a lot of brain noodles.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's, we have a kind of a multiple crises going on right now, and one is, trust in institutions, what is valid and what can be validated. And some of that mistrust is maybe well placed from my perspective, but some of it is actually deliberately manufactured to be undermining. And so it becomes very difficult to begin to navigate all of this, and it can be exhausting. Um, in the paper, I was reflecting on both individual things that we can do to develop, more mindfulness and care around our own consumption and our own sense making, but also, obviously, big things to do would be on the systemic side to make sure that we have organizations that are doing their due diligence to uh, be fair and not to be overly invested in, in ideological spin or hijacking the limbic system in order to get, clicks and likes and things like that. So I think we need some kind of restoration of of institutions that are really dedicated to that. I think we can, at least I do that. I do look to well-established news sources and academic sources and try to, um, choose the best ones. In some ways, I think whatever kind of the naive way that we used to relate to media, I think those days are gone. I think there's, with our decentralized sourcing of information now, and also with so many institutions being taken over by imperatives towards profit and entertainment over news and factuality, there just unfortunately is more work put on us than there was in the past. And I'm hoping, through some of the suggestions that we can explore in this series, and that I Am is doing, and other things, we can find people and develop tools that will help us navigate in this kind of tumultuous landscape better.
Yeah, so I guess I just need a really smart AI bot to filter everything.
Right.
Put 100%
Yeah, exactly. So I know one thing that Mark wanted to do was to go over just a kind of a recap of what we did last week, and go from there. I won't cover where he was going to go from there, but I'll give this recap, and then I'll give something that I was reflecting on for this week's talk. So one of the things that we looked at last week was, the poly crisis and the meta crisis, those two terms and their relationship to each other, and why we're doing a series like this on planetary meta studies and a view from somewhere. So polycrisis referring to the convergence of multiple interlocking crises, climate change, political polarization, economic instability, things like that. And each of them in their own ways amplifying the others. So it's just it's a wicked mess of wicked messes. And then the meta crisis, there's a lot of different ways to frame that, but one way you can look at it is, it situates this convergence of problems within a deeper structural and existential set of issues. Our disconnection from our ecosystems, our meaning making, and the fragmenting of our, fragmentation of our shared reality. So all of these problems within that, you could say context that takes more of the four quadrants into account, is what we would call the meta crisis. And so the meta crisis frames the poly crisis not only as a practical challenge, but also, it's a systemic and a philosophical one. It necessitates integrative and meta-theoretical approaches for understanding and intervention. And so that's part of what we want to look at in this series, and that's very much part of what, the Institute for Applied Meta Theory is wanting to do. It feels that for the nature of some of the problems that confront us, the day really is here for these kind of meta lenses, to be able to parse what's going on and to offer a nuanced, analyses and suggestions for intervention. So another term that Mark introduced was what he calls the meta clearing, and big picture science. And so what Mark calls the meta clearing, it emerges as a kind of, as a conceptual space for reflecting on and integrating multiple perspectives and fostering, big picture science, which I think is, we've had meta theory in development for many years, but I think it may be reaching some new levels of development and sophistication. And so this approach is needed to address the complexity of the polycrisis and the metacrisis. And this involves stepping back from siloed viewpoints to map interdependencies across disciplines and worldviews. And so we can draw on insights from, systems theory and different integral frameworks. And within that, the meta clearing, which is the space in which we can hold these multiple meta lenses, it will enable a deeper collective insight by engaging different epistemic and methodological approaches. And two examples that I brought up in the last session were critical realism and integral theory. But in this space, we're also looking at a lot of other approaches that are also useful. For instance, Edgar Morin's complex thought, or Bruno Latour's actor network theory, or inquiry into the modes of existence. Also, Donella Meadows' work on, systems thinking, especially looking at systems traps and systems interventions. So there are a lot of different lenses and approaches that we can take within that meta clearing. And I'll get to some principles around that in just a little bit. But Mark, wanted to use, he introduced an analysis that looks at empirical, middle range, and meta range levels to help us understand complex phenomena. So, the meta lenses are, as meta theories, are theories that allow us to bring together in a coherent way empirical tools and different theoretical tools, and then various meta-theoretical or vision logic tools to be able to scaffold our understanding, whether we can have direct empirical inquiry, theorizing around that, and then kind of meta-level integrative networking of different findings. And we'll come back to that in just a little bit. So I mentioned he also talked about the power of story, which could be false and partial, but also real. So stories shape how we perceive and enact reality. And a story may be false or partial in its claims, but it remains real in its effects. And it can impact behavior and meaning making and social cohesion. Narratives about identity, progress, and crisis drive action or inaction. So, just framing things in any particular way can really lead to actions that are unpredictable. And for instance, I was talking to somebody about this in looking at, for instance, the significant immigrant and turnout for Trump, and the narratives around that. Make America Great Again. A lot of people see Make America Great Again as a hearkening back to a 50s or prior era of inequality, and way things used to be organized around certain assumptions and principles and values that privilege some over others. And that's often how we've, from within progressive or left-leaning media, looked at what that phrase means. But for instance, within the immigrant community, I interface a lot with Chinese, Indian, Nepalese, and Vietnamese and other communities. Make America Great Again resonates and lands very differently, and it actually catalyzes a different kind of action. Among many immigrants that I've talked to, they came to America on a vision, on a kind of mythic vision of America, of a place of great opportunity and all kinds of aspects of it that would be beyond or above what they were used to in their own contexts. My wife has talked about, she was raised to think that America did things differently than what she saw as regular nepotism, bribery, and corruption in her own country. And so she was raised on a vision of America being above and beyond that. Of course, she's not naive and she recognizes the reality now, but there are a lot of people who, when they hear that phrase, "Make America Great Again," especially among the immigrant population, they're hearkening back to a sense of the world or a sense of America as that promised America, not the America as it's showing up right now. And so it doesn't necessarily relate to a perception of going back to a period of white privilege or inequality. So anyway, that's just an interesting thing that I was exploring the other day with some friends around that impact of narrative and how it differently lands. Another thing that we talked about last week was ideology and enactment, especially in relationship to hyperobjects and interobjectivity and object-oriented ontology. And hyperobjects is a term that was coined by Timothy Morton in his ecological writings. And hyperobjects describe phenomena like climate change, but also like the digital landscape, that are so vast and distributed that they transcend human scale comprehension. And interobjectivity, which draws on object-oriented ontology, a speculative realist philosophical school that's been popular in the last decade or so. It highlights the relational and interdependent nature of entities within these hyperobjects. So ideology in this framework is enacted through these interrelations, shaping how we engage with systems and structures, often in unconscious ways. And so our challenge lies in fostering a more conscious enactment aligned with integrative and ecological principles. And Mark had a number of slides which he was beginning to introduce last week and which he was going to present this week on what he calls, there are different maps of looking at how mediation works, and he calls it the activity triad. So we'll probably come back to that a little bit later when he's here. Then we've talked about it. I won't really dwell on it. We talked about algorithmic biases and Boscar's demi-reality. So that's kind of the stuff that I just talked about at the beginning of our talk here. And also looking at alienation through social media and what kind of integral interventions we can make. And so, I was highlighting in my paper how social media exacerbates alienation, what I call stratified alienation, different fragmented experiences across personal, social, cultural, and systemic levels, a kind of rupture that happens at each level of the of the quadrants, if we imagine them stacked. And then what kind of interventions can we make? So, for instance, at the personal level, developing in the upper left, developing digital mindfulness practices and algorithmic literacy. At the behavioral level, breaking algorithmic habits and diversifying information sources. At the cultural level, cultivating narratives and communities that resist algorithmic control, or at least are more aware of that influence. And then at the systemic level, redesigning algorithms and economic incentives to prioritize, instead of, say, just the parasitizing or the vampiric focus on attention, incentivize connection, diversity, reflection, things like that. And so those interventions could combine to counteract the alienation produced by algorithmic systems and promote healthier, more integrated engagement with digital and social realities. So that's kind of an overview of the ground that we covered last time. And, maybe for those of you who weren't present last time, that will at least give you a sense of the overall context that we're building here so far. So before I go to anything else, anyone have anything that you'd like to ask or comment or reflect on?
Right. Well, I think one of the common threads here is that we have these, in some cases, ingrained processes for doing things, so certain algorithms, and we also are primed to take in information in a certain way and to produce a gestalt. Now, I think looking at these meta-theoretical lenses, integral theory and critical realism, there's a certain element that I see that isn't, well, that other systems really foreground, that these two don't really seem to foreground as much. Like looking at Vervaeke's 4 Ps of knowing, wherein you have this perspectival knowing, and this is probably that is the gestalt, right? That is, and then we have the procedural knowing that we have these procedures for muscle memory, and then we produce these propositions, things that we supposedly can understand and articulate. But that's what's actually kind of at the bottom of this stack is the participatory knowing. That's the fittedness that is essentially priming our gestalt. And you can also see something similar to this in Forrest Landry's Immanent Metaphysics, where he has the 3 modalities of the immanent, transcendent, and omniscient, and also Nava Israel, who was on the Integral Life podcast a few weeks ago, who has this cone understanding, and that so I see this sort of common thread running through several of these systems that is not really clearly called out or articulated in either integral theory or critical realism as a distinct element, because I think that this sort of thinking, this sort of process that begins with, what you can say is participatory knowing, or in some cases it's alethic resonance, that is the ultimate ground, and it's kind of the middle of the quadrants, isn't it? And that the sort of perspectives and procedures and propositions all kind of come from that in all of the quadrants.
Yeah, I think those are great points, and I want to go over some principles that I want to propose for integrative meta-level inquiry. And so I'll touch on that, which is that none of these lenses can do the work on their own. And I definitely agree that, Vervaeke's 4 Ps or some of the other ones that you mentioned do bring in important perspectives to also consider. And, I think on the one hand, you can look at each of these approaches and see how they do unfold them, but they may not necessarily surface them in the same way. For instance, participatory and procedural, you can definitely find that within an integral approach in terms of, you can justify making those kinds of distinctions based on quadrants and levels, or particularly if you use something like I've created with the integral grammatology, which looks at not only perspectives and levels or things like that, but also processes and relationships and other elements of reality that really very clearly, especially like the prepositional approach, really evokes what's up for us at the level of participatory reality. So yeah, definitely, I think all of those things are important. And in my own integral grammatology, I have this concept called ontochoreography, which is a practice of circulating lenses or meta lenses to like, it's like turning the kaleidoscope and letting a new constellation emerge each time you turn the kaleidoscope. And it's important to make a practice of that kind of circulation so that you can both see some of the ontological realities that can be disclosed through the gifts of a particular lens, but in their circulation, then you can also see what is absented or occluded by, one lens that the other one might bring forward. And so there's a real need for a methodological and an ontological pluralism there. And also for like the alethic dimension that you're pointing at, Boscar's critical realism, the whole thing is focused on that stratified level of reality and kind of like the alethic disclosure of being across the stack. And so it's there, but again, it gets pulled forward in different ways. And so the lenses can actually play together, I think, very fruitfully to help us be more nimble in our sense making. And Phyllis, did you have your hand up?
First, thank you so much. These sessions are remarkable. And I barely have the language to ask the question that I want to ask. There are actually two questions, so I'm going to do my best. They're focused on what you've been talking about, the fragmented sense of shared reality. And the idea that, I mean, the difference between, say, the last couple of decades and what happened prior to that is, we may have been given false realities, but we had cohesive narratives. The narratives were very, very cohesive within at least groups, so that you knew what your narrative was, and you knew what your, quote, enemy's narrative was, and it was quite clear. Now that we have access to so many different realities, so many different, as you said, it's not even a question. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. What matters is you give somebody enough options so that they don't trust anything.
Right.
And right. So you're in a situation where you don't trust anything. Now, does that put us in a situation where, William sort of joked about it, but where we are putting ourselves in a situation where we are going to require AI, which is algorithmically produced, to discern truth that is produced by the algorithms in AI. So it seems very, very circular. So that's one of my questions. And then the other question has to do with what you're talking about, the other side of it, which is how we're perceiving the meta crisis. And I love the title of this session, which is A View from Somewhere. And you just sort of touched a little bit on the sort of kaleidoscope way of looking at through lenses and looking at reality. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the relationship of the perspectives with which you're looking at the issue and the hyperobject itself. So because it seems like, Vervaeke speaks about the transjective, what's between those two, and are we in a place where it's what's between those two that may perhaps have some answers for us, more than either looking directly at the object or the way we look at the object, but looking at the relationship?
Yeah, great questions. Thank you. And I'm really, I'm actually a little bit worried about, where we're headed. If we're going to need, systems upon systems of mediation, even to begin to make sense of the world that we live in, where we really are living in, a noospheric cloud, layered cloud of different narratives, which, Wilbur for ages has been talking about the postmodern aperspectival madness. And I think, our technologies and now with AI too, we really are perched on this vertiginous edge where we could fall into an abyss of floating narratives among floating narratives. And how are we going to get out of that? So, I think one of the things that's been coming out of postmodernism, of course, and also out of Bohm and other people is, feminism, really looking at embodiment and also the importance of embodied cognition. And so I really think, we're going to probably have to develop aspects of our own embodied knowing in a way that we possibly haven't imagined yet, to help us deal with this and to remain grounded in some way. I kind of want to get into that with some principles in just a little bit and think about how we begin to approach some of that. But to look at what you were just asking about, hyper objects, and which again, Timothy Morton defines them as entities that are massively distributed in time and space, and so they typically exceed the limits of human perception and comprehension. We mentioned climate change and the digital networks, the noosphere itself. There are really many different things that could be seen as hyper objects. And so they're not only ontologically complex, but they're also epistemologically elusive, meaning they resist reduction to a single discipline or a single perspective or a methodology. And so this is especially where this kind of meta-level transdisciplinary practice becomes indispensable for us. Really, I think it was at an integral conference in Sonoma, possibly. We were talking about wicked problems, and there was a group dialogue or something. But I remember at that point it really clarified for me that hyper objects are objects that are disclosed by our transdisciplinary meta-level approaches. We don't really begin to see them until we begin at this meta level to hold multiple disciplinary views together and see what emerges from their co-holding. And that's where the shape of the hyperobject begins to take form for us. We begin to realize, oh, this isn't just seasonal changes here or acidity changes here or whatever. This is a global, complex, interrelated, vastly distributed thing. And to be able to begin to make sense of it, first it begins to be disclosed, but then for us to be able to even interact with that and work with it in any effective way, it takes these meta-level transdisciplinary integrative approaches. So, you could say, why is meta-level practice crucial? Well, one, epistemic integration. No single discipline can fully grasp the multidimensional nature of hyperobjects. Climate change is simultaneously a physical process, an economic issue, a cultural narrative, even a deeply personal experience for some people. So transdisciplinary methods grounded in frameworks like integral theory, critical realism, but many of the others that we just named also. So with those, we can begin to synthesize insights from diverse domains and allow us to see, hyperobjects at least in fuller form. I don't know that they're the kinds of things that we ever can see them as a whole, but we can definitely begin to perceive more of their spectral influence behind the scenes and in and through a lot of the stuff that we experience in our ordinary sensory ways. So meta-level approaches like AQUA can provide a way to map and hold the complexity of these phenomena. But we also, need these approaches, you could say, for the matter of, kind of like alethic or ontological disclosure. And so because hyperobjects exist beyond immediate human perception, so they require different methodologies that can bring their hidden dimensions into view. So for instance, interobjective dynamics of social media algorithms are not directly visible to others, but meta-level practice, which combines empirical observation with systemic modeling and phenomenological inquiry, can make these dynamics intelligible. But we have to be able to look at all of those things together. And of course, Wilber has been calling for the development of an ordered transdisciplinary way of working, which he calls integral methodological pluralism. And so, yeah, I think something like that is really important. And Bhaskar's concept of alethic truth really aligns with this. So they're also needed for ethical and pragmatic reasons. Kind of the scale and the stakes of hyperobjects demand not just understanding, but also coordinated action. If, I'm reading The Ministry of the Future right now and kind of talking about the futility of so many of our bureaucratic and governmental approaches to managing these complex problems. And so, if we want to avoid what happens for people in the Ministry of the Future book, which is about catastrophic climate change, we've got to get better at doing this. And there are definitely ethical and pragmatic reasons for this. So transdisciplinary meta-level practice can bridge the gap between abstract understanding and actionable solutions by linking epistemic insight with ethical imperatives. And so that's, for my paper, I was trying to explore that kind of intersection in relationship to cultural and political polarization, mediated by our digital information landscape. These meta lenses are really good for discerning interobjective dynamics. And by that, I mean the relational webs that connect objects, systems, and entities. They're often invisible, but they're deeply influential. And so whether it's the interaction of global markets or digital platforms, ecological systems, understanding these dynamics requires a capacity to think relationally and integratively. And, so of course, we're developing computer systems and other things that can follow feedback, loops and systems and network relations with more fidelity than we can just with our, unaided senses for the most part, and our unaided, cognition. So often these things operate with, once you get beyond 2 or 3 feedback loops, and all the interactive nonlinear dynamics, it's hard for us to parse all of that with our unaided minds. But we can develop more skill in that area, and we can develop at least the knowledge to know when we need, technological assistance to be able to call forward patterns and make sense of them. And so, yeah, just the main contention, of course, is that these approaches are really important for dealing with wicked problems. And I teach a class in my university program on living systems theory, and we really focus on wicked problems. And all of the students take these meta-level approaches, systems thinking and integral and other approaches, and they pick global wicked problems and start to really, use these lenses to, one, analyze, what's going on the ground, who are the stakeholders, what are the systems traps, what are the feedback loops, what are the best intervention points. So all those kinds of things, and these meta lenses make that kind of perspective taking possible. I usually have students do that in groups because, again, shared intelligence is I think the direction that we need to move in, collective insight and shared intelligence, more and more than relying on lone genius kind of work. So those are some of the dynamics related to hyperobjects and why these meta-lens approaches are really important for dealing with the divergent rather than convergent, the divergent problems that comprise what we're calling the polycrisis and the metacrisis.
Thank you.
And yeah, so I know we have just a little bit of time, but I wanted to go over some principles I was thinking about recommending for doing this kind of planetary meta studies. And I can go into that a little bit, but I want to just pause for a second again and see if anything came up for anybody, questions or insights on your own to what I was just discussing about.
Eric's hand is up, Bruce.
Sure, Eric, yes.
Hi, Bruce. Good to see you again. This is great. I love this work. So just hearing you talk really gets me going. So I did a presentation a few years back as well. In my research, I've been doing the same thing by using the 4 quadrants and just looking at what sort of transformational learning occurs. And my question for you is, and somebody had asked me this, I was just kind of doing more of like a pilot study in your traditional science education setting at a university and trying out this 4 quadrants model. And it really demonstrated, I think, very clearly that, like you were saying, when you go through that sort of kaleidoscope through it, it's going to catch somebody's blind side at some point. And then that's where the transformation unlocks. So my question for you is, can you speak a little bit more to that? Like, do you spend like maybe more time per quadrant to build depth in there? Or do you just kind of do like a cycle through here, talk about it, then go through another cycle a little bit later? Like, what approaches do you feel can really unlock that sort of transformation?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of ways to do that, but yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's something that, I've been trying to actively explore in my classes. And so I can give you one example of like how we're using this and how it can give, yield some insight. Um, there's a way of, if you want to take a complex problem, there's a way of at least beginning to inquire into it by naming all the different factors that you think are relevant to that problem, and then laying them out in a circle, and then beginning to draw lines between the different points to see how they might be influencing each other. And so you can end up with these complex cat's cradle kinds of maps of lines of influence between different elements or factors within a given problem. And so those could, be certain stakeholders, they could be certain system dynamics, they could be certain legal or environmental or other kinds of factors. And you just want to lay them all out and trace connections between them. But then what I've done is I've put like a big 4 quadrant map on the ground, and I've had people, stand in a if all those different elements are named for a system, have them stand within, the quadrant area that relates to what they're, relates to, what the factor that they've identified, and then get a yarn, and we have everybody make connections between each other, and you can begin to see not only, where are the patterns in terms of like what elements are more connected or not, but also whether one or others of the quadrants seem to have, greater preponderance of weight and connection. Is it showing up more that there's a lot of systemic issues? Is it showing up more that there's a lot of ideological or values issues? Or, how is it, where are the clusters of connections really constellating? And there's a couple caveats around that. One is, at least on the first pass or two through this, one of the things that this exercise is really good for really is beginning to disclose your own assumptions about what's going on. You may not actually get a very good, clear mapping initially, but if you go through it several times, you can begin to refine that. And then what I do is I've had different groups do the same thing, and then they can look at what factors they identified for that problem and how they linked them. And again, comparing, each other's maps, and then entering into dialogue around, what they were seeing and what they were emphasizing and why they were making those decisions, can again add another layer of clarifying insight into both the assumptions, but also into the possible dynamics or generative mechanisms that may be going on within the system. And typically, one of the things that you're wanting to do with, a kind of mapping like that is, because a divergent problem is one that you can't typically solve with a single solution. Instead, you want to try to identify what are, some of the most likely intervention points where, because of the amount of connections there, a change there might have more ability to ripple through the whole system. So just doing that kind of mapping can give you insight into where you want to maybe focus your efforts initially. But understanding that is not going to be, that there is no single solution. It's more a complex layered dialogical interaction with the hyperobject than any kind of single fix approach. So I don't know, does that help or?
Yeah, it does because a lot of times, I think about like our community here where a lot of people are well versed, but this is highly complex thinking. And when I talk to people who are not familiar with integral theory or complexity theory or theory in general, it's like, okay, but a lot of these people are like, fully formed adults who are capable of critical thinking. But if I start talking too abstractly, it quickly unwinds. So I've realized that in a classroom setting where there's a little bit of structure, it really helps that. But I'm also thinking of, well, how do you think about it developmentally for the people who are on the ground floor and have to get there? The four quadrants seems to be a good practice to just kind of get the generator spinning, like get that turbine spinning around. And I love the ideas that you have because I think it starts to reveal where people are at. So like in climate change education literature, a really common finding in teaching all across the world is that people tend to understand it at a personal, societal, or global level, but they don't really translate it between those. So you're talking about like an introductory familiarity with the hyperobject, but then you're running through that generative cycle of the four quadrants that can really bring about the other layers of perspective to start to stack on top of one another, where now the complexity really reveals itself. So I love the way that you said that. That was great. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I agree. And I think, in a number of my classes, people coming into it they're smart adults, but they're not exposed to a lot of this. And so I find, really practical, even physical exercises are really helpful to begin to get a sense for some of this. So if you want to try, I want to just do something fun. It's a systems exercise that we do in the class. So if you want to try it with me, and some of you may know this, but I think it's really interesting. Take your finger and point it up, right? Like you're doing point it up, number one, and then point it up at the ceiling and begin to draw a clockwise circle. Just circle your finger in a clockwise direction. And then as you do that, slowly move your hand down until it's even with your chest. And then keep going and moving in the circle and moving down to the level of your abdomen. And then look down, and what direction is your finger moving?
I love that. That's great.
So you just ask the people, what happened? What's going on there? Usually people will go back and do it one, multiple times to see.
I thought you were gonna ask us to keep spinning the hand while then also moving moving your toes on the floor in the other direction.
Right. And pat your belly too at the same time. But yeah, that basically is a way to show that when we're thinking about systems, we can't think about systems as detached from us and existing out there, unrelated to us. Our perspective is a part of the system. So that system was a clockwise thing, but that involved and included your perspective on it. That's why it was a clockwise movement, because it was in part, contingent on your perspective. And when you brought it down here, your perspective changed, and therefore the system actually showed up differently for you. It now is a counterclockwise thing. So that's a very immediate way to feel how our perspective is dynamically related to what we're perceiving as a system or an entity. All right, so I think, we basically actually have about 45 minutes, right? So I can go maybe in 15 minutes over some principles, and then we can just open it up if you'd like. I'd be really interested in your feedback. I've just been, in preparation for some of the work I'm doing with I Am, and also for this exercise that we're doing with, Greg here for this series. I've just been thinking about what are really key principles that we want to bring to, an integrative meta-level approach. And so an obvious one is epistemic humility. And so, that's the recognition that there's no single theoretical framework that can fully encompass the complexity of reality. And so it involves approaching other frameworks with an attitude of openness and respect. So why it matters is, there's no single framework, no matter how robust, that can capture the full complexity of reality. And each perspective will offer partial truths and insights conditioned by its historical, cultural, and disciplinary origins. In class last night, I was just talking with a student about this principle of, from Jainism called anikantavad, non-one-sidedness. And basically, it's a core principle in the Jain religion, sometimes called the circle of truth. But basically, it relates very deeply to Wilber's principles of non-exclusion, and that things that different approaches are true but partial, and therefore we should always make a practice of considering them alongside other approaches. This is not just a bare relativism, but it is recognizing that each approach has both its affordances and its limitations. And so practically, with epistemic humility, we acknowledge the limitations of any given framework, and we treat each perspective as a heuristic, not an absolute truth. And we embrace an attitude of learning from rather than competing with other approaches. And I would, maybe qualify that piece a little bit by saying that even competing with is not, again, is useful. That kind of tension can be generative, but that way you then enfold the competing with within the overall circle of learning from, because even competing, you can learn. Second principle would be ontological, a kind of a commitment to ontological pluralism. And a lot of ways to look at this, Wilber's whole post-metaphysical turn really, where we have to look at reality as not just given, but as in part enacted by us and by our perspectives, just like we were just doing. So there's this appreciation for ontological pluralism, and it's an approach that honors the irreducible contributions of different aspects of reality and perspectives on reality, and allows diverse theoretical frameworks to coexist and complement one another. And so it matters because different meta theories often emphasize different aspects of reality, such as individual subjectivity or intersubjective meaning or system dynamics or causal mechanisms. And so, looking at Vervaeke's model or Bhaskar's model or Wilber's model, all of them are probably inclusive of all of those domains, but in their own natural evolution and unfolding and practical application, often they tend to emphasize some more than others. And so this is something that, we've been exploring. Sean Hargens, Nick Hedlund, and many other people working on, complex integral realism, looking at how these things complement each other in generative ways. And, so practically they can allow multiple ontological levels. And, like Bhaskar's stratified reality or Wilber's quadrants or Bruno Latour's actor networks. So you can look at those things as coexisting without having to force them into a single explanatory hierarchy. You can hierarchically organize them, but you can do it in multiple ways. In my own integral grammatology work, I have a concept that I call henoontology. And it's maybe not the best word, but I take it from henotheology. And henotheology is a polytheism, which is it has a floating one, where it's a polytheism where you recognize multiple deities, but any one deity can be seen to enfold and encompass all of them. So you can relate to Krishna and Vishnu as enfolding all of the other deities, but you can also relate to Shiva as enfolding all of the other deities, or Kali, or other goddesses enfolding all. So each one could stand in place of one in which the others are organized, and that can vary according to context and individual. So what I call henoontology is you can take integral as the master narrative, and then look at how all the others fit within it. But you can do that equally with Boscar's or other approaches, and you can watch how holographically they can play within one another. So another value then is methodological pluralism, and methodological pluralism is basically the use of multiple methodological approaches that are tailored to the specific challenges and dimensions of a problem and can enhance the richness of our inquiry. And, this is important because, each meta-theoretical framework develops its own methods for engaging with reality. And so it could be through systems modeling. It could be, which would be like Edgar Morin. It could be through ontological critique, which is more like critical realism. It could be through quadrant mapping and looking at the alongsidedness and the tetrainaction of things. That's like the integral approach, or tracing relational networks, like actor network theory. And again, other approaches too will have their own particular methodological strengths. And so none of them are sufficient on their own, but together they can form a richer toolkit. And so adopting a kind of both and approach to methodology is important. And then methods are selected based on their appropriateness for the problem at hand. Context sensitivity, I would say, is another important principle and value. And this would be the principle of tailoring theoretical and methodological approaches to the specific context and problem being addressed, so you can ensure their relevance and applicability. And, different frameworks may be more or less applicable depending on the specific context or problem being addressed. And so again, it's good to have this flexible meta-theoretical set of lenses that you can kaleidoscopically to shift and deploy. Another principle really is to work with generative tensions, to recognize that that while there is some incommensurability between certain models, that doesn't have to be a problem. We can hold them in tensegrity. Thinking about the principle of tensegrity, where the structure is actually enacted and held together by the dynamic tensions between elements that would seem to be at odds. And so there's a productive interplay between contrasting frameworks that can highlight their strengths and also their blind spots and foster deeper insights. So working with those generative tensions can, again, help forward both the strengths and the blind spots of different approaches. And the relational tension between frameworks can generate creative insights. And so rather than trying to resolve all differences into a seamless synthesis, we can hold frameworks in productive dialogue and allowing their differences to illuminate one another and each one another's blind spots. Another principle would be an active coherence. And this is a dynamic, evolving coherence that emerges through the practical application of frameworks to real-world challenges. So it's not an order that's imposed top-down, but instead it's something that emerges from the interplay of perspectives as they engage with real-world challenges. So it's actually, I found that actually, in working on that paper on algorithmic undertow, I was surprised, for instance, by the synergy that emerged when I began to look at the dialectic of presence and absence that is highlighted in critical realism, and Wilber's pre-trans fallacy, where often in the absenting of certain levels of reality and the creation of a demi-reality, the dynamics going on in social media that are creating certain demi-realities, they feel compelling and they may actually feel like something expansive or good, but when you really look at it, it actually turns out to be a pre-trans thing where it looks like it's a higher thing, but actually when compared to our more integrated, fully embodied experience, it's a simulacra that is actually empty and missing some important pieces. And so it's a pre-trans confusion. So I didn't know that coherence between those two approaches was there until I started circulating these lenses. And then I discovered, wow, how interesting that both those lenses can play together in a coherent way, but also how these dynamics illuminate each other and cohere. So I talked before about that circulation, that autochoreography. So you can foster coherence through iterative cycles of application, feedback, and refinement. Another value is pragmatic utility. And the focus there is on the practical effectiveness of the frameworks in addressing real-world challenges, rather than necessarily on theoretical elegance alone. So yeah, just really looking at, pragmatic effectiveness of it. And the ultimate test of any integrative meta-theoretical endeavor is its capacity to generate actionable insights and guide effective responses to complex challenges. So at the Institute of Applied Meta Theory, that's something that we actually talk about a lot, which is that, we have all of these different lenses, and now with the context software, we can do even more kinds of analyses. But what is the yield? Is it giving us something that's really actionable and practical? And so, we believe that it is, and I've had experiences, with it being effective in the classroom. But I think the overall test over the next 5 years with IAM is to see, what is actually the yield practically in society for institutions and individuals who are looking for our help in analyzing things in these ways. Of course, there's the value, the principle of ethics, an ethical approach to meta theory. And so we have to have a commitment to human and planetary flourishing that grounds all integrative efforts in ethical responsibility and care. Wilber's prime directive, for instance, protecting the greatest depth for the greatest span, or looking at Boscar's, principle that the free flourishing of each is necessary for the free flourishing of all, and the free flourishing of all is necessary for the free flourishing of each. How those things are, mutually generative and supportive, and how can we, organize our meta-theoretical efforts around those kinds of values, recognizing that in using these lenses, it's not just a neutral or purely intellectual exercise. We've got to be guided by commitment to human and planetary flourishing, in part because, as I think we're already seeing with what the gaming of the digital reality by certain actors, the more that we have this kind of meta-level understanding, which you could say is part of the secret sauce of ontological design, when you know that you can circulate perspectives and narratives and other things and actually shift people's worlds, people can use such knowledge for ill, for sowing confusion, fragmentation, and discord. So, there's a really practical reason to focus on ethics and ethical development and values development within meta-theoretical practitioners. Another important one is what we could call meta-level reflexivity. And this is a self-reflective awareness of how the process of integration itself shapes and is shaped by theoretical assumptions, biases, and blind spots. And so any meta-level project risks blind spots, or what we might call like a metamyopia, where the integrative process itself becomes unexamined. And so certain reflexivity argues against this and guards against this. I think integral theory, is a theory that, of everything or for anything. And even though it is as comprehensive as it is, and it may be one of the most robust ones that have been developed so far, nevertheless, going back to the epistemic humility we mentioned at the beginning of these principles, we have to recognize that any model is based on a set of decisions which absence some things and presences others, and therefore, even at the integral level, we need to assume a kind of plurality of lenses and approaches so that they can complement and illuminate one another. And then there, of course, can be further practices of beginning to trace what are, you could say, homeomorphic equivalencies, what are commonalities among all of the different lenses. But I don't think from my own perspective, that you'll ever arrive at the single model. Instead, I think it's much more prepositional exploration and attitude of finding the coherence in the between, beyond that exceeds any single integrative gesture. Which I've talked about this elsewhere multiple times. Wilber says that there's no master holon, no holon that is the final holon that encompasses everything. There's always, it's unending. And so we jokingly say that any holon that pretends to do that is an assholon. One other principle, I've got several more, but I'm just going to cover one more, which would be ontological depth. And that's an appreciation for the stratified nature of reality, and it recognizes that phenomena exist and operate across multiple levels: physical, psychological, cultural, systemic, and that different frameworks may be better suited to specific levels. And so reality, this is important because reality, I think we can make, and John Vervaeke has actually made a very strong case that reality must exist at different levels, that there must be a leveled view of reality for science even to be possible. We can talk about that later if you want, but basically, because reality does exist at multiple levels with different theoretical approaches often best suited to understanding them, then we need to basically think in terms of ontological depth as we're applying our different meta-theoretical lenses. And so we can use this to map how different frameworks illuminate different levels of reality, or allow multiple ontological perspectives to coexist without forcing reduction, which again, that was one of Wilber's very first insights with the spectrum of consciousness, which is not only epistemological but ontological. That different psychological approaches are obviously seeing different levels and different layers, and we can let them coexist without forcing reduction. So that's a set of 10. I've got a few more, but I think I've been yapping on enough, and it's the 30-minute mark. So happy to take any responses to that, or to open it up into more general discussion.
Brandon's hand is up, and if there is time, maybe we can still return to that list. And I don't know if you'd be willing to maybe share your screen a little bit, just so that we could at least get a screenshot even of all of the methodologies that you have come up with, or principles. Brandon's hand is up with that.
Sure. Yeah, Brandon.
Oh, well, I had a thought about something. I could save it mostly for later, some other time, but like, as you were talking about the context app, and that it's based on integral methodological pluralism, and then also to take kind of a meta methodological stance to see, how could it be improved? And you're also looking at the ethical considerations. So I'm remembering how Ken was talking about this, and he said, okay, he prefers the 8-zone model because it's easier to wrap your mind around. You definitely wouldn't want to stay with just the 4 quadrants, because that doesn't bring in just the recognition that there are background grammars of how you even perceive things. And you're not going to introspect your way into recognizing that, whereas you could do pretty well in the waking up side of things, but not the other recognition of the growing up and those processes and structures behind it. So that's why we have a distinction between zone 1 and zone 2. But that zone 2 being based on this structuralism and this levels, if we actually open it up, whereas Ken said, okay, he's seen like the quadrant relational model, and he sees it, not necessarily needing to be that complex, but you actually get more from this, because if you see zone 1 as a relation between an upper right and upper left, that bringing in a lower right relation to the upper right, you actually then can bring in things like this spectrum, or this that you may have a lot of these levels inside of you, and that depending on the context, they come out. The IFS becomes a different methodology that is a lot, it fits into the system a lot better as a distinct methodology if you do that. And also looking at Hansi Freinach's work, you may be familiar with this, where those guys were looking at the lower right as having of relations to other quadrants, and then bringing in different ethical considerations. Where if you do that, you have deontological, virtue, consequentialist, and social contract ethics all opening up as being essentially that's what happens when you subdivide zone 3 and recognize it. Well, what you're doing there is you're just having relations between the quadrants. So this is something that could eventually be enhanced into the context app. Although I recognize, things get combinatorially explosive. So depending on what is actually the problem at hand, some of those zones or relations between the quadrants, some of those methodologies are more relevant than others.
Yeah, I agree. I think the lens, the lens of the 8 zones is really useful. And I know Corey will be watching this video to edit it and put it out. And I think Corey himself has been doing fantastic job of doing 8 zone analyses of relationship and political phenomena and other thing. And so, yeah, there's a lot there. And when you're mentioning also exploring the relationships between lenses, again, yeah, the point about being combinatorially explosive or being excessive in all the different tools that we use and the different things that we can do, we want to balance parsimony with richness. But just as if people are interested, I think I could probably find it somewhere still online if you haven't seen it. But Bonita Roy did a wonderful presentation about 10 years ago where she was trying to imagine the future of integral theory. And she explored what would happen when we began to develop a model that actually looked at various relations between and integrations of and constellations of the different zones into a new kind of lens. So how, hermeneutics playing together with social autopoiesis and phenomenology creates another distinct kind of lens for other kinds of insight. And so she unpacked that in a really elaborate chart that was really beautiful. So that's worth exploring. But yeah, there's a lot to, that's part of what we're going to be doing with IM and with context, is throwing a lot of stuff on the table and then seeing what really bubbles up as the most useful to the most people. It may be that we need a great many lenses. It may be that ultimately only a handful does the bulk of the work. But right now, I think it's like William, what's his name? William James. Yeah, sorry about that. William James, when he talked about the birth of psychology and the importance of kind of keeping an open-ended pluralistic attitude while the field is still taking shape, because you don't know what ultimately is going to have the most impact and yield. So you kind of keep it all in play and don't worry too much about incommensurability because of that principle of coherence I was talking about. As you circulate them, the coherence is going to emerge between, and I think that'll be generative overall. Wheaton, did you have your hand up?
Thank you. Boy, I'm learning so much with you. I'm loving your presentation and last session too. A lot of the vocabulary is very new to me, but I have a question about some stage work that I've been doing with my friends and colleagues. We're exploring stages as a way to understand our own development, to understand where our ideas come from, understand where our blockages come from. It's a marvelous way of doing it, I think. But it's not the only thing. And I hear so many people talk about stages sometimes as something that's real. And if I'm at this stage, well, that explains just about everything. And it really doesn't. It's just one way of looking at things. And when I get into that kind of discussion, I can talk about the poly nature of so many other aspects are going on at the same time within Wilbert, you know, the lines and types and all that stuff. But can you approach the discussion about stages using the meta approach that you're describing and so beautifully? It's, you know, I resonate with it, and I want to bring it into my discussions on stages and my understanding on stages. And I wonder if you could just look at that for a moment, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, I kind of wish Mark Edwards was here because he had a good article more than a decade ago where he talked about what he called altitude sickness within the integral community. And this is not at all a criticism of altitude as a concept or of developmental stages, but an over-reliance on stage theory to make sense of everything as a, you know, to the exclusion or at least to the, to be overly prominent in our sense making. And that definitely, you know, there's a number of things that can go along with that altitude sickness, which is in part, it can be easy to assume that a certain altitude, you know, correlates with a certain position, and, you know, to confuse content and level, for instance. And, you know, I think you and lots of other people have probably very readily discovered that actually you can't make any kind of one-to-one correlation between a certain perspective on an issue held and your level. You can usually find you know, a plurality of perspectives and positions and defenses within an overall you know, developmental level. And one of the things that I was looking at, and in fact thinking about in our, you know, in expanding on my work on the algorithmic undertow, Mark in his presentation, and maybe, you know, if he can join us next time, he'll go into that in more detail. But he uses levels in this meta context, which I also, you know, hinted at in my paper, is he talks about just simple basic levels that you could correlate to pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. But he doesn't line it up exactly that way. Instead, he looks at, you know, gut level reasoning, and then kind of rational reasoning, and then intuitive meaning making and reasoning. And what I think is, you know, for instance, in exploring the algorithmic undertow, and I was suggesting a scaffolded set of approaches to help us, you know, deal with this phenomenon, and what are we looking at, and what are we working with, and there is, you know, and what is the direction that the systems are pulling. And for instance, you know, we can find within, you know, the digital media landscape, with the way that the algorithms work, they typically pull orientation more towards the gut level, because they really are maximizing for impact and attention and reaction and reactivity. And so, you know, even though they are sophisticated meaning making, you know, radically complex systems that, you know, that have been developed by people with a great deal of intelligence in their own operation and in their own, you know, dissemination and interface with human psychology, the overall effect of it is actually a pull towards the gut and the lower and the pre-conventional to some degree. And so then we have to think about what are approaches that we can take that will counteract that undertow that's pulling us towards the pre-conventional and the gut level reactivity, and help us guard against that in our meaning making and sense making. You know, it's so easy to see, you know, how you know, the polarization has gotten carried away into the directions of unnuanced demonization and tribal thinking and all of that kind of stuff. So what are approaches that we can take that counteract the pull towards the gut level, which would be rational level, approaches, which could be the cultivation of digital mindfulness, or it could be, again, the use of different tools that help us begin to make sense of the complexity that confronts us. And ultimately, moving towards, you could say, collectively, a construct awareness, where the more that we begin to exercise in these ways and begin to see how we each get pulled into our own holodecks, Star Trek holodecks of reality, with some of the different digital dynamics and the cultural and social dynamics in play. Once we really begin to see how these systems play together and ontologically design what we experience as our lived worlds, which often are demi-realities, that is, we can begin to approach that with certain rational level tools, but ultimately that is, I would argue, moving us towards a more holistic and intuitive grasp of the whole that rests in what you would call, construct awareness, where you're beginning to see how, the role that your thought and your decisions and your perceptions and the forces that are actually delimiting your perceptions play in the construction of what's showing up as world for you. The more that we begin to grasp that in an embodied and intuitive way, that's moving us towards vision logic, and towards what Mark is calling the intuitive level. I have a concept that I call the acategorical imperative, that you could put in here as another principle, but it's also related to this and to the development of this kind of intelligence. And basically, the acategorical imperative, it means a willingness to both to play with categories and lenses and perspectives, but always to bracket them within a willingness to being, within an overall attitude and willingness to challenge them, to let them be held up against others, to perceive their limitations, to see them as influencing in an inactive construct. So the acategorical imperative puts us in this kind of between space where we can deploy lenses, but we can also step back and see, oh, what's happening here? How can I be mindful of the influences this is happening, and what protocols and methods and even technological things can I put in place that helps me recognize these patterns and better grasp them. So that holding the acategorical imperative is important for I would say the overall post-metaphysical approach that Wilber is encouraging, that sees the inactive interplay of our worlds and our stances and our senses and all of the ways that those things play together. I don't know if that went to address your question enough or not, but I'll be happy to take a different direction if it didn't.
I really love the whole. I have simpler words, but I love the awareness of what's happening as it's happening between you and I, and between I and the idea. I mean, that's so important. It's beautiful. Anything else you have on how to examine ourselves through stages in that open? I don't have your vocabulary. I wish I did. I love your vocabulary. But in the open, non-judgmental curiosity as we look at ourselves and others. Anything about that?
I don't know if this is helpful or not. I can tell you an exercise that we do in one of my classes. It's one that I did with myself in terms of just thinking about and working with the different levels, which is one, really appreciatively attempting to inhabit all of them. And of course, Wilber's integral meditation does this in a very beautiful way of taking us through, gut level and sexual level impulses all the way up to higher level reasoning, in a mindful way. But something that I've done in classes with this, because in some of the places where I've taught, I initially encounter students who are really allergic to the idea of stages and levels and don't want to go there necessarily. But framing things in this way has been helpful for me and people I've worked with for appreciatively inhabiting each one. And in a sense, you can, yes, they build on each other, but there's a way that we can kind of pull the, the binders out. If you've got all the levels stacked, right? You've got probably access to at least a number of them. You can imagine them held together by like little pins and string. And if you pull out the pins, all of them collapse, and then they're all there as possibilities that you can play with and enter. And that temporary suspension of the ranking, just as a type rather than a level, can allow for, I think, a dynamic interaction and interplay with them that later you can go into it about how they build on and scaffold each other. But just suspending that for a time can allow people to more appreciatively enter into each and see how the world is enacted through each. So just using spiral dynamics, sometimes I talk to students about, look at each spiral dynamics color and think about the days, the ways, and forays that you have related to that level. So for instance, a red day would be when you were, in your, early childhood, 2, 3, up 4, 5, up like that, you're inhabiting the red period of time. And that's your days when you are just naturally there in your own developmental unfolding. Then the ways would be the way that even though you are no longer inhabiting red anymore as your primary center of gravity, nevertheless, there are ways that red will still manifest itself in your life. Or sometimes having to use like an IFS method, if red is very deeply repressed, then you might have to explore the ways that red is deeply repressed in you. But it usually will find ways to leak out. And then the forays has to do with actually, while you're no longer in that place, or possibly when you have not ever been in that place, you nevertheless make an effort to expose yourself to that and to begin to see how it impacts you, how it impregnates your own sense making and shifts things. And so an example of that that I've sometimes used is there, I used to be pretty strongly practicing Christian in my youth, and I went to a Christian university, and then I got stung and burned, and I left it, and I turned my back entirely on Christianity for a while and didn't want to have anything to do with it. So after a while, I noticed that I had a fixation and an allergy to blue. And so a foray exercise that I did without calling it yet, that was to deliberately expose myself to blue media and listen to it until I would no longer react from a reactive place, but that I could take in what was being said and actually hold it in a fuller way and relate to them as human beings, where before I had fragmented against them. So that's one way of playing with those levels where you can kind of again, we were talking earlier today about like these ontological strata. What in Wilber talks about the levels of the self, where there's the antecedent self and the proximate self and the distal self. The proximate self is where you're making sense right now. The distal self is where you used to be. And the antecedent self is the clearing in which you can hold those and allow them to play together. I don't know if that helps.
That helps immeasurably. That's probably exactly what I was looking for. I love it. Thank you so much, Bruce.
Sure. Yeah, anyone else?
It seems like, there's so many of your wonderful principles that you were offering us. There's something that just feels really simple, but yet maybe not so simple. Also, it's just the simple reality of constantly needing self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Just this thing that I think we often just take for granted, of just being self-aware. Yeah.
I actually liked the tone and the speed with which you spoke that, because you shifted the field just by doing that. So I appreciate that. And one of the things that we were, just kind of touching on and briefly, and I'm hoping next time we'll have an opportunity for that when Mark is able to make it back here. This mediation of our reality and really looking at how, really in terms of that self-awareness, and the construct awareness, a big part of that is really understanding this mediating and relational lens, and looking at how, for instance, the algorithms are mediating both our sense of self and our perceived social realities and our behaviors, and how those play together in a kind of a triangular interactive relationship. So Mark has a lot of slides looking at how parents interact with children and political dimensions of that and social dimensions of that. And so I think we'll come to that probably in our next gathering, and he can really unpack he's got great illustrations of what some of those dynamics are.
There's a nice question in the chat, the last one. Bruce, you might want to read. I do want to quickly mention just Edward, who just opened his video. He's a criminal lawyer. I hope you don't mind me speaking about you, but Edward mentioned something that seemed really useful to me somehow. Edward, you were talking about how it could help you to have a checklist when you are making certain legal decisions or when you get a new case in how you look at it, to see whether it's like a checklist of what is the kind of cognitive bias I might be bringing to here? Is this something that I am what am I projecting onto? Or so he hasn't built that list, but I was really encouraging him to build that list, because I think having a certain kind of a checklist in these times where we need a meta narrative or a meta lens feels kind of really useful somehow.
I think so. That's a great idea. And, you may or may not have seen what's called the Andre Marquis' book, The Integral Intake, which is a wonderful book that basically contains a checklist of questions that you want to ask when you're working with your client in a psychological context, that you're really covering a full range of perspectives and and checking your own bias and blind spots and things like that. So I think something comparable for working with legal clients could very definitely be built. And in some of the earlier I Am meetings that I was at the Institute of Applied Meta Theory, we were also talking about what would be a very useful intake, kind of, integral intake checklist to develop for deploying meta theory, so that we make sure that we're doing it in an ethical and a rounded way, in one that's both nuanced and grounded. So, I think some of these principles that I was talking about could be part of that. I developed a table that, for instance, looks at pain points associated with dynamics and a certain kind of a sliding scale, and what quadrants they relate to, and multiple dimensions to think about how different aspects of the application of meta theory should be evaluated if we're going to be making decisions and making interventions. So yeah, I want to say I think that is a great question, and I know that there's some work in those directions that we're doing at I Am, but I think more definitely could be done.
Well, maybe this is a good place to close. Bruce, how do you feel about that?
I feel good, and I thank you for being patient with me. My decision today was that I was just going to be the passive responder to things that Mark talked about. So I had not really come in with a plan to fill up a couple hours talking. But so thank you for your patience and your wonderful questions.
Thank you so much, Bruce.
Thank you.
We will see you in a couple weeks again, hopefully both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.